So let's look in a little more detail at some of the clues and evidence that Egyptologists consult in these Giza mastabas, these private or non-royal tombs, to help us with dating and trying to make sense of how this place developed. There are inscriptions to look at, and there's archaeological evidence to look at as well. Let's break it up into individual pieces. For inscriptions, of course, we have texts, we have decoration, we have the style of the relief carving on the walls, epigraphic features, the way certain signs are decorated and carved, all kinds of clues that can help us try to date these monuments. In the archaeological record, we have the position of the tomb, its architecture, the layout of the burial. We'll get to those a little bit later on. So inscriptions. Two basic categories here. Direct evidence, where we have maybe a biographical or historical text or a statement telling us about the career of the tomb owner. That's very helpful. The indirect evidence is when we look at the forms, the way things are carved, the epigraphy, telltale elements that the craftsmen have left behind. In a sense, we have to read between the lines in that case. So now we go to direct evidence in the area called the central field, behind the Sphinx and in front of Khafre's pyramid. Here there is a fantastic labyrinthine-like tomb of a man named Ra-Wer, and he's very famous for this object. This is a vertical inscription that talks about a specific event, actually an accident during a ceremony in the presence of the king. You can learn more about this in another module that will translate the text. Here, I'm just pointing to the cartouche, or the royal name. That's the oval ring that you see up in the upper right-hand part of the text that gives the name of the 5th dynasty king, Nefer-Ir-Ka-Re. So here's a real historical event, localized in time, and we're even blessed with the name of the reigning king. Perfect scenario. How often do we get that? Not as often as we might wish. Indirect evidence now. This is the way signs are carved and other types of elements in the decoration. As I said, we have to read between the lines to understand this. So here is the tomb of a man named Yasen, and you can see he's seated at the left in front of those tall vertical objects. Those are actually cut loaves of bread on a table. This is called the funerary meal. And you'll notice that the bread loaves are shaped and colored in a special way. Some have a reddish hue, some have a yellowish hue. Believe it or not, the shape of those loaves changes over time. So we can actually date some of these tombs by whether the loaves are tall and thin, or short and squat, whether they're facing each other or facing all in one direction. Believe it or not, little details like this on the tomb walls can help us with dating. False doors by themselves change their shape as well. So you remember, the false door is the nexus point. It's the connection between the land of the living and the land of the dead. They're always in the west walls facing eastwards toward the living. And here you see a comparison. On the left is the older form, where the individual jambs or niches are basically unadorned or undecorated. On the right, in the second half of the Old Kingdom, we get a fancier form where there's that sort of bulbous molding going around the outside, known as a torus molding, and then at the top a stylized version of reeds sort of gathered like at the top of a fence and flaring outwards. That's known as a cavetto cornice. You'll see that in Egyptian architecture as well. Another element to pay attention to, although perhaps not so helpful for dating, is the occurrence of raised relief versus sunk relief. In this comparison above, you see how the figures are standing out from the background. They are raised, whereas below, everything is incised or depressed into the stone. Sunk relief. These are the two decoration modes that the Egyptians used, and we'll talk about those in more detail in Module 7 when we talk about Egyptian art. We can talk about three types of inscriptions, where to find them at Giza. In the superstructure, that's the building above ground. In the core of the mastaba, the cult focus, the chapel, the serdab, the statue chamber, etc. Then, number two, we can look in the burial chamber down below ground. And finally, three secondary inscriptions, things that were added later burials, graffiti, for example. So let's briefly look at a few examples here. In the superstructure above ground, any exterior wall or chapel inscription would be fair game here. And we can look at examples. So here is an example of a chapel decorated wall. You're looking at the west wall of a man named Senenu Ka. It's the only decorated wall of the four walls in his tiny little chapel. Good example of a superstructure decoration. What about underground, the burial chamber? Well, very often at Giza, these are not decorated, but occasionally you get some with paintings or scenes, and of course you might get a coffin or sarcophagus that is inscribed, or other elements of burial equipment. So this is a famous tomb, belongs to a man named Khayyam Ankh, and it has a beautifully decorated, painted chamber with lively scenes of bed making and preparation and livestock and other elements. You can see how tight it is under the ceiling there. It's not a very tall space to be in. And then, of course, sarcophagi as well. This is an inscribed sarcophagus for a woman named Meres Ankh from the Eastern Cemetery. Finally, a third category of inscriptions are secondary texts, later additions, later burials, intrusive types of elements. What are we talking about in this case? Well, let's go to the chapel of a man named Senejimib Inti. His son, Senejimib Mehi, has added a text on the outside of his wall and talks about how long it took to build his father's tomb. It was 15 months, one of the few examples we have of architectural longevity. So clearly, since the son added this inscription, it's a secondary text. It's a later addition. As we wander around Giza, we can even see graffiti in various places. Here's the second pyramid of Khafre, and if you walk to the west, where the cut enclosure wall is formed out of the cliff, you can see an 18th dynasty graffito, or a text that was added 1,000 years after the Old Kingdom. This one lists the overseer of construction projects in the Temple of Ra, and his name is Mai. And he has a longer text nearby as well. So Mai wanted us to remember that he came to Giza and visited the site, and he carved his name there. So can we use these types of inscriptions to help us with dating the tombs? We can. Not all texts help us, but here is a list of the kinds that do. When you get the name and titles of the tomb owner, or the name and titles of relatives or servants or mortuary priests, that can lock you into a particular period and help you. If there are biographical texts telling us about the career of the deceased, and maybe mentioning a king, that would be fantastic. Genealogies, who's related and descended from whom, that will certainly help. And then something called domains or funerary estates. These are named offering bearer individuals. I'll show you those in a moment. And then we can get more portable objects such as seal impressions or graffiti added to the tombs. So let's briefly look at all these categories and take an example from each one. The name and the title of the tomb owner. Well, that's obvious. He puts his name on everything from architraves to false doors to all kinds of wall decoration. This is Chenti again, and you see the horizontal text at the bottom of this block gives his name right at the end, Chenti. Names and titles of relatives and servants. Here is a Ka priest. This is just one of many in this particular tomb, but he's labeled in hieroglyphs, so we know his name and we have his title, servant of the Ka, or Ka priest. Biographical texts. Well, in the 4th dynasty, we don't get too many of these, but they come due in the 5th and 6th dynasty. They're much more elaborate, and they give us more history of the careers of these individuals. Genealogical inscriptions. Very often in the tomb, we'll see family members portrayed. So here is the tomb owner, Ka-Nefer, and his mother standing behind him, and then the arrow is pointing to a little figure of his daughter, and it says his daughter, and it gives her title, and her name is Merititis. So very often you'll have sons and daughters and wives and mothers and others indicated in the tomb to help you put the genealogy together. And then funerary estates or domains. These are not actually individuals, but they're people who represent certain districts in the country. So here you see many female offering bearers, and in front of each one is a designation in hieroglyphs that tells you their district, such as the marshlands of Sahure or the fields of Khufu. These are ways that we can link up a tomb with known kings, because these districts bear the names of reigning kings. It can be tricky for dating, and I'll get into that a little bit later. Then we get seal impressions. These are little mud seals bearing names or titles of individuals. They can be used to seal canopic chests or vessels at the burial. And so Reisner and his colleagues felt they were very good indicators of a specific point in time. Hermann Juncker, however, who dug for the German-Austrian expedition, felt they were too portable, and therefore he was much more skeptical that they were useful for dating. And then building graffiti. You see this little limestone block with a few traces of red paint on it. That's actually a graffito added to the block, and it adds a date. It says year of the 5th occurrence. That's sort of a biannual census, which means we double it. So it's really the 9th year of a particular king. Unfortunately, his name is not there. But these types of graffiti added to architectural blocks can sometimes help us localize an individual tomb in time. Here's another famous graffito. This is inside the Great Pyramid at the top of the relieving chambers above the King's Chamber. And you can see the hieroglyphs there that says the Friends of Khufu. So this is probably one of the work gangs. Helps us to date the pyramid as if we didn't know already that it belongs to King Khufu. But an excellent example of a secondary addition or a graffito added to a monument. Now, if you see the name of a king on a particular object, you might be tempted to think, okay, that object dates to that king. But that's a dangerous way to go. It really just indicates what we call a terminus antequem non, or a terminus before which not. In other words, if you see that reigning king, you know that the monument must date to that king or later. The only certain thing is it can't date to before that king, because of course he would not have a royal name. So here's an example of a cartouche or oval ring of King Khufu, builder of the Great Pyramid. So we know that this tomb dates to Khufu or later. The only thing we're certain about is it can't date earlier than Khufu. Otherwise, you wouldn't have his name in a cartouche. So this false door of a man named Khufu Ankh shows you a little bit more how tricky this could be. His name is Khufu Ankh, may Khufu live. He's not a royal person. He just has a name compounded with the name of the king. So you might be tempted to date him and this false door and the tomb to the reign of Khufu. However, if you look down at the smaller figure of his son's name is Menkaure Ankh, may Menkaure live. That is several reigns after Khufu, and so we know this monument has to date to at least Menkaure or later. So don't be fooled by cartouches that you see on particular monuments. The same thing with these funerary estates or offering bearers. We get Khufu's name here from Dynasty 4, Sahure from Dynasty 5. So again, these districts or names compounded with royal cartouches only indicate their time or later. The only thing we're certain about is that they cannot predate the existence of these kings.